Imagine you're living in the Roman era, and there's this mysterious tribe called the Cimbri. These folks lived up in northern Jutland, but here's the kicker, no one can quite figure out who they really were. Some say they were Germans, others swear they were Celts. Sounds intriguing, right? So, in the late 2nd century BCE, the Cimbri decided to go on an epic journey. Picture this, they roamed through the Balkans, climbed over the Alps, wandered across Gaul, brushed by Spain, and finally made their way into Italy. And they weren't alone. Other tribes, especially their neighbors the Teutones, joined them on this grand trek. When they reached the borders of the Roman Republic, they didn't just sit around, they took on multiple Roman armies and won. Their biggest victory was at the Battle of Arausio in 105 BCE, a total disaster for Rome. But like any good story, there was a twist. In 102 BCE, under the leadership of Boiarix, they crossed the Alps and settled north of the Po River in Italy. Unfortunately for them, the following year, they were defeated by the Roman commanders Marius and Catulus at Vercellae. The survivors were enslaved, but some bits of the tribe stuck around in eastern Gaul and back home in Jutland. Now, let's rewind a bit. The Cimbri first popped up in Roman history books in 113 BCE. They lived in western Jutland, next to their buddies, the Teutones. This area was full of Germanic tribes, so many think the Cimbri were Germanic too. But here's a plot twist. Their chiefs had Celtic names. Some say the Romans, not knowing much about the German tribes, gave them Celtic names. After all, the Cimbri and Teutones had hung out in Celtic lands for years before meeting the Romans, so they probably picked up some of the language. Even ancient authors couldn't agree on whether the Cimbri were Germans or Celts. Tacitus and Strabo thought they were Germans, while Appian and Florus said they were Celts. Plutarch had his own theories, suggesting they might be Gallo-Scythians or even the legendary Cimmerians. So why did the Cimbri leave their homeland? Around the end of the 2nd century BCE, rising sea levels flooded their coastal lands in Jutland. Losing their homes, the Cimbri and Teutones saw this as a sign from the gods to find better lands. They embarked on their journey through Europe, encountering and sometimes clashing with local tribes. Historians often exaggerated their numbers, but realistically, they were probably around 150,000 people, including men, women, and children. Not everyone joined the migration, some stayed behind. Those who ventured south traveled along the Elbe, then east along the Danube, moving through Germanic and Celtic territories. Their journey was a mix of battles, alliances, and trade as they interacted with various tribes. Eventually, the Cimbri and Teutones moved west, following the Drave River through the Carni Alps. By 113 BCE, they had reached the Celtic kingdom of Noricum, which was closely tied to Rome. And now things were heating up for the Cimbri in Gaul. The Roman consul Papirius Carbo was sent to deal with this so-called barbarian menace. Now, the Cimbri didn't want any trouble and accepted Carbo's offer to escort them back across the Noricum border. But here's the twist. Carbo planned an ambush. The Cimbri, however, fought back fiercely, and the Romans would have been completely wiped out if a sudden storm hadn't ended the battle. Carbo was blamed for the disaster and took his own life with poison. After their victory, the Cimbri and Teutones crossed the Alps and were joined by the Celtic Tigurini from western Switzerland. They moved into central Gaul, pillaging the countryside and causing a mass exodus of people to walled towns. But the Cimbri didn't know how to lay siege to these towns, so while the walls kept them out, they couldn't stop starvation. Many townsfolk and refugees died from hunger and likely disease. In 109 BCE, the Cimbri coalition moved into Gallia Narbonensis, only to be blocked by another Roman army, this time led by Consul M. Junius Silanus. The tribe sent envoys asking for land and offering their services to Rome, but Silanus refused. Battle ensued, and just like Carbo, Silanus was defeated. Despite their victory, the Cimbri and Teutones turned back north to plunder Gaul for 4 more years. During this time, the Tigurini split off and defeated another Roman army northwest of Tolosa in 107 BCE. 2 years later, the Cimbri and Teutones returned to the borders of Narbonese Gaul. Then came the Battle at Arausio in October 105 BCE. 2 large Roman armies, led by consul Gnaeus Mallius Maximus and proconsul Servilius Scipio, were waiting for the Cimbri and Teutones near the Rhone. But the Roman leaders were quarreling, and Scipio refused to follow orders from the lower-born Maximus. This division was disastrous. The Cimbri, led by King Boiarix, captured Marcus Aurelius Scaurus, a Roman legatus, who defiantly dared Boiarix to invade Italy. In response, Boiarix killed him. The main Roman armies were then attacked. Scipio, seeking glory, initiated the battle on October 6th, but the Cimbri and their allies were ready. The Ambrones, a fierce tribe, led the attack and broke through Scipio's ranks. The survivors fled towards Maximus' army, but with morale low, the Romans were massacred. They suffered up to 80,000 casualties, making it one of Rome's worst defeats, even worse than the famous Battle of Cannae. In their victory celebrations, the Cimbri sacrificed captives, drowned Roman horses in the Rhone, and threw Roman weapons and treasures into the river. Despite their overwhelming victory, the tribal coalition did not immediately press into Italy. The Teutones and Ambrones continued to pillage Gaul, while the Cimbri wandered towards Spain. They crossed the Pyrenees but were turned back by the Celt-Iberians. Returning to Gaul, the Cimbri rejoined their allies in Belgic Gaul. Some tribesmen settled there, but the majority were determined to push towards the Roman frontier once more. This time, it was a 2-pronged assault. King Boiarix led the Cimbri over the Brenner Pass, while the Teutones and Ambrones, under King Teudebad, moved down the Rhone Valley. The Tigurini, meanwhile, returned to the Norican Alps, and the Cimbri were determined to secure new lands for their people, crossing the Alps into northern Italy in 102 BCE. As they descended along the river Adige, they faced their first serious opposition from proconsul Quintus Lutatius Catulus and his Roman army at Tridentum. The Cimbri attempted to flood the Roman positions by damming the river and hurling mountains of earth and trees into the water. Despite the Roman soldiers' initial fear and flight, a small group held their ground, impressing the Cimbri enough to spare their lives. Settling north of the Po River for the winter, the Cimbri plundered the fertile lands. By the summer of 101 BCE, the stage was set for the final showdown with Rome near Vercellae. Consul Gaius Marius, with his newly reformed legions of career soldiers, and proconsul Catulus, commanding traditional militia, faced off against the Cimbri. Boiarix, sensing the tide turning against his people, sent envoys to negotiate with Marius and Catulus, demanding land for the Cimbri and their allies, the Teutones. Unbeknownst to Boiarix, the Teutones had already been defeated by Marius at Aquae Sextiae the year before. Marius responded to the envoys by showcasing the shackled Teutonese chiefs. Enraged, Boiarix rode to the Roman camp, challenging Marius to battle. The Romans agreed, and on the Rhodian plain, the two armies faced each other. The sun behind the Romans cast a fiery reflection off their helmets as they waited for the Cimbri advance. The Cimbri, though better equipped than before with captured loot and horses, were physically weakened from their winter of plenty. They advanced in a massive square formation, with cavalry on their flanks. The battle began with Cimbri cavalry feinting retreat, luring Catulus soldiers into pursuit and exposing their flank to the Cimbri infantry. Marius quickly ordered his wings forward, enveloping the Cimbri in a dust-choked melee. The disciplined Roman legions, accustomed to the Italian heat, pressed hard against the disoriented Cimbri. Boiarix fell in battle, fighting to the end alongside his men. Those who survived retreated to their camp, where the women, facing the grim prospect of Roman enslavement, made a desperate last stand behind a makeshift barricade of wagons. In a tragic end, facing the horror of Roman capture, many Cimbri women killed their children before taking their own lives to avoid slavery. Thousands of Cimbri warriors were killed, and tens of thousands ended up as slaves in Roman markets. Following their catastrophic defeat at Vercellae, the Cimbri as a unified force ceased to threaten Rome, but their story did not end there. Many survivors, especially the younger generation, faced the grim fate of slavery. Some of these captives would later join Spartacus in his famous slave revolt, the Third Servile War from 73 to 71 BCE. This rebellion, though ultimately unsuccessful, highlighted the enduring spirit of resistance among those who had once challenged Rome's might. Meanwhile, remnants of the Cimbri and their allies, the Teutones, remained scattered across Gaul. Some integrated into the tribal kingdom of the Suebi Ariovistus in Alsace. This group faced Julius Caesar's forces in 58 BCE during his campaigns against the Belgic tribes. Others settled east of the Rhine in territories like the Odenwald region near Miltenberg and Heidelberg, establishing new lives far from their original Danish homeland. Among the eastern Belgi, another faction of Cimbri and Teutones formed the Aduatuci. In 57 BCE, during Caesar's campaign, they attempted to resist Roman conquest by retreating into their heavily fortified stronghold near Antoine. Initially surrendering and seemingly disarming, they later launched a surprise night attack on the Roman camp, though they were ultimately defeated. The survivors were enslaved, and their stronghold fell to Caesar's forces. Back in Denmark, the Cimbri continued to live on, maintaining their cultural traditions and identity. In 5 CE, during the early years of the Roman Empire, Tiberius successfully negotiated with various Germanic tribes, including the Cimbri, marking a shift towards diplomacy over conflict. As a gesture of goodwill, the Cimbri presented Tiberius with their sacred cauldron, symbolizing a newfound peace and respect between their people and Rome. Even beyond their homeland and the Roman frontiers, the legacy of the Cimbri endured. In the Odenwald near Heidelberg, they worshipped Wodenaza, their version of Odin, whom the Romans equated with Mercury. This cult persisted into Roman times, as evidenced by votive inscriptions dedicated to Mercurius Cimbrianus, dating from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, highlighting the lasting cultural impact of the Cimbri on the regions they once inhabited. Thus, while the Cimbri's military ambitions were quelled by Rome, their cultural footprint and resilience persisted across centuries, influencing both their contemporaries and future generations in ways that extended far beyond the battlefields of ancient Europe.